Many a good tussle I had with other classes of criminals, but I'd rather the worst of these than a scuttler. For though the former will use their hands and their feet freely enough, the knife is seldom thought of.
Over 100 years ago, the northwest of England was facing a violent epidemic of which it has never seen before. Young men battled in the streets in their numbers over cold-blooded rivalries of territory and power.
This violence became known as scuttling, and this is the story of Manchester's first gangs. The cultural significance of scuttling in Manchester and Salford can be seen through the wealth of resources found at the archives of the Salford Museum, the Working Class Movement Library, and the Manchester Central Library, in which many archival documents and photographs used in this documentary were collected. Although sources documenting this 19th century crime are limited, the majority of sources are found in the northwest, where the hub of scuttling existed.
Scuttling was a Victorian word for fighting. Scuttling in particular was a real issue in Victorian Britain, especially in industrial towns like Manchester. And a scuttle was literally a fight which was involving weapons. They were on the whole fairly sort of amateur weapons, so they would have been belts, bottles, anything that they could really get their hands on.
The heavy brass buckle is a most fearful weapon in the hands of an unscrupulous youth.
A lot of people do refer to them as the scuttlers. I just refer to them as gangs, because that's what they were. They were gangs.
Local historian Michaela Hulme believes she has found evidence of a darker and more organised side to the scuttling gangs, and disputes Dr. Andrew Davies' claim that scuttling was a pastime for lads, not men.
With scuttling, especially in Manchester, there's this real myth that it was groups of teenagers that were running riot. There's this myth that it was fairly unorganised, but scuttling in Manchester, especially during sort of the late 19th century, it really was organised crime. If you read some of the more modern texts about scuttling, you sort of have this idea that it was gangs of youths, sort of 15, 16 years old. But it was a lot deeper than that. These were real organised gangs. These were men. These were running the doors in Manchester. So, you know, if you wanted to go to a particular music hall or a particular venue, they had a certain amount of control over the city.
You had the music hall and so on, and cost money to get in. But there were all sorts of stories about people, certainly kids, sneaking in and not paying.
The main sort of occupations sort of within the criminal world would have been protection. So, you know, you pay me a weekly fee and I'll protect your club. Or if you don't pay me a weekly fee, I'll make sure that something happens to your club. These gangs, you know, as I said, we've got this real sort of mixture. So we've got this really highly organised section of the scuttlers, and then we've got the very young sort of unorganised section. So it was quite hard to police, and I think because if you look at the areas where they were, Ancoats was a big area at that time.
Scuttling was a sensation of the late Victorian Northwest, an area renowned for its horrendous working and living conditions, especially for the working class. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels famously visited this area while working on the Communist Manifesto, and in 1844 Engels wrote of the damp and squalid conditions in Salford streets. They also famously visited the pub that we're sat in now, although at the time it was called the Red Dragon.
It is under these conditions that scuttling came to prominence, and most, if not all of the scuttlers, would have been unskilled labourers or unemployed. We spoke to local historian Dr. Craig Horner about the conditions that the scuttling gangs lived in.
These gang members would be living in one of those terraced houses, usually. There'd be typical working class kind of environments. And the Coronation Street kind of image that we have of row upon row of smoky terrace would have been pretty much in place by the end of the 19th century. And it boils down to really basic stuff. You have to pay your rent, otherwise you get evicted, and you have to feed yourselves and your family. But tenants would have had no protection, and if they started missing payments, they would be evicted.
Today, the conditions of these areas are obviously much improved. However, there remains evidence of the gangs through the street names still found in Manchester and Salford. Scuttling gangs were highly territorial, and appropriating their street names was a fitting example of this. Probably the most famous example of this is the Bengal Tigers from Bengal Street in central Manchester.
On the whole, most streets in Manchester and Salford would have had some sort of scuttler gang, and I'm talking really about the working class streets at the moment. So you're talking working class areas like Ancoats. So you've got Prussia Street, you've got Bengal Street, you've got the Grey Mare Lane boys, and it was a problem not just for those that lived on these streets. The authorities in Manchester who were debating on, if you have a look in the Manchester Guardian, they were debating about how to best deal with scuttlers. You know, what do we give them longer sentences? Do we lock them up?
The Mayor of Manchester requested a meeting with the Home Secretary of the time, Henry Matthews, to debate the issue. Unfortunately, little was decided to help prosecute scuttlers, as they could not be prosecuted for their mere presence, and evidence of a recognised crime being committed by them was often absent.
You imagine, you know, there's poverty, you haven't got a lot of money, you're struggling for employment, that all fueled with alcohol. You can see how it's sort of a hotbed for these gangs to sort of populate and then fight within each other.
As with now, alcohol would be very much a major contributory cause in the violence that was taking place. You had a temperance movement which was trying to discourage people from using the pub, but this was easier said than done. I think any particular group of people that feels kind of dispossessed or in some way sort of disadvantaged, they tend to be the sorts of communities that then appear in the newspapers having, sort of got drunk and caused some sort of trouble. And the whole thing then became a vicious circle.
A lot of these, young men did work, so it's not as if they were, they just stayed at home all day and had fights. That wasn't the case. A lot of the crimes happened when they were leaving work or going to work, or, they'd been on a night out, so obviously they could afford alcohol and would meet their ghastly end in a scuttler fight. Check
the police records. If a constable found somebody who was drunk and disorderly, they would arrest them and then they'd put them in the cell for the night and they'd sleep it off.
Scuttling was different because scuttling, it could be anybody. You could be walking down the street and you would witness it or you would see it happen. And I think if you only take a look at how many streets had gangs on their street, they all had their own individual gangs which would not only fight with each other, would then cross over and go and fight in Salford with their gangs as well. And if you're going to organise a fight, unless the police had a tip-off, it was hard for them to know where these fights were going to take place.
The idea that large groups of scuttlers would march to another area of Manchester to challenge the local lads is not uncommon. To a scuttling gang, it was seen as one of the highest achievements to come home victorious from another gang's patch.
In numerous accounts of gangs hunting out and attacking rivals in their own areas come with their own horror stories. One young scuttler, John Gilbert, was left fighting for his life in Manchester Royal Infirmary for 10 days after a knife wound sustained in an attack from Gorton scuttlers.
Scarcely a day passed without someone being brought into the Manchester Infirmary in consequence of violence used in these scuttling affrays.
Just days later, and in an act of revenge, Gilbert's gang, the Grey Mare Lane boys, launched an attack on Gorton. The ensuing violence lasted for half an hour and caused chaos in the local area, with windows being smashed and minor injuries being inflicted on passers-by by loosely thrown stones.
Local accounts of this outbreak estimate that there were up to 300 youths fighting hand to hand, and this extreme example shows just how out of hand a scuttling rivalry could get. However, there were times when the violence was prevented.
According to Dr. Andrew Davies, it was here in Plattfield where a group of around 50 young men, armed with an array of weapons, came to challenge the local boys. Terrified locals were quick to alert the police, and a squad came down and managed to intervene before the ensuing violence. However, the police can be successful every time, as the constable Jerome Caminada found to his own peril. In his autobiography, 25 Years of Detective Life, Caminada remembers his first altercation with a fighting group of scuttlers, and recalls his shock in finding his police presence made no difference.
The two factions, resenting my interference with their little amusement, had combined in making the bobby the target for their shots.
One of those shots, a hit to the spine from a cobblestone, proved decisive and Caminada was taken out cold.
The idea of sort of policing a large town and a large community was something that was new to the 19th century. So by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, the police force is much more professionalised. You would have a police constable, they would have a uniform, they'd have a set beat that they'd need to walk. The idea of the 20th century professional police force was starting to be in place.
You'll see that sentences for crime really did vary, and I think some people are shocked at possibly how lenient some sentences were, and then maybe, you know, shocked the other way to see how harsh they were. There was a case of a scuttler who got transportation. There was another case of William Willan, who was a murderer, who was convicted of murder, but he had quite a cult following. So, you know, when he got convicted, you know, his sort of his gang, you know, he was like a cult leader, and in the end he got his sentence got reduced and it was penal servitude. He got sent over to Australia. I think some of them did have particularly harsh sentences, and I think that was just the way of trying to deal with them, trying to hope that it was enough of a deterrent that if we sent these people over to Australia, that, you know, their gangs wouldn't do it again, or they'd think, oh, we don't want to, you know, see what's happened to William, we don't want that to happen to us.
To the scuttler, imprisonment is valueless as a deterrent. It only elevates him into a hero. One touch of the lash would do far more good than years of imprisonment.
They were trying to think of new ways that they could deal with scuttling, but I don't think it ever kind of worked. I think it was more a change in what was happening within society.
The police force was becoming increasingly professionalised all over the country. The idea of a policeman working for a local force was a relatively new one, and the police, for some time since the 1820s, 1830s, when you had the Robert Peel reforms, and he created the Metropolitan Police, so that set in place a model which other cities were encouraged to take on, and they didn't have to, but by the end of the century most large towns would have had some sort of active police force. The way the systems used to work prior to that would have been completely unsuitable for what was happening in the 19th century when towns were becoming so much bigger.
I don't think anybody at the time really knew how to deal with it. Conditions by the end of the 19th century in prisons, especially in Manchester, we had Strangeways at that point, they were harsh. They'd been worse, so, you know, if we look sort of further towards sort of the 18th century, early 19th century, it was particularly grim, so it was a deterrent, and they were still bad.
Conditions would have been pretty hard. You would have had a bucket that you'd have to sort of slop out and that kind of thing. Much better than the 1840s, 1850s, but compared with now, pretty awful.
People convicted of scuttling in the northwest would more often than not be sent to Strangeways prison. Strangeways was based on the model of Pentonville prison, which aimed to imprison a man in a place that would provide structure and safe rehabilitation away from a life of crime. However, this was not shown in its methods. Opened 7 years before the 1895 Gladstone report, imprisoned scuttlers would have faced painful and violent methods of correction.
There were many different types of systems that they would use to try and stop scuttlers reoffending. One was called the treadmill, which literally was a treadmill, and they would go all day on this treadmill. Or they would put them to work within Strangeways, so they would be doing things like making clothes. They would have occupations, they would have jobs sort of within the prison system. But for some people who were really struggling, it was a dry, warm place to sleep with food. Some people would purposely put themselves in prison because it was better than where they lived.
It would have been pretty grim though, a dirty, dark, insanitary kind of environment.
But if these were sort of career criminals, so if they were, for example, if they were scuttlers or if they were thieves, fraudsters, generally they would have committed more than one crime. Every scuttler gang had a king, and he would have been the the gang member that had won the most fights. He could be the oldest, he could be the most respected, but I suppose in modern day terms you would say he would be the hardest. So he would be the one that would be the toughest. He would be, you know, he'd had the most fights, he'd won respect, and he was the most feared.
To keep the position he has attained, he becomes more of a ruffian than before.
A couple of lads would have a fight and they would be in the same gang, and then whoever won would be the king of the scuttlers.
Across the northwest, lads' clubs were set up to combat the violence and turn the youthful energy of the scuttlers into a positive, with sports, arts, cultural and educational activities. Salford Lads Club was opened in 1903 and was officially opened in 1904 by the founder of the Boy Scouts and famous veteran of the Boer War, Robert Baden-Powell.
If he came along to open somewhere, that would be a really big coup. You know, it'd be like getting a sort of a pop star or something to open an event these days, you know, in terms of getting the public in. These were sort of very famous characters who had a culture, their culture had been sort of immersed in India and Africa and so on, and so they were very much men of their time, and they were seen as heroes back home.
Baden-Powell's official appearance at the club is truly indicative of its purpose. He had strong opinions on the correct training of boys in good citizenship, and also witnessed firsthand the dire state of young men from areas such as Salford during the war.
The formation of these clubs and the public endorsement from such men was suggestive of how scuttling, as part of the wider problem of poor health among young working class men, had become of national concern. There was now a concerted effort to help these young men make a positive impact in their communities rather than terror them. Some of the actions taken by scuttlers were truly abhorrent, and they were responsible for terror and fear. However, near the end of the century, working class lads were increasingly viewed in a new light, as victims of a degraded environment, and the effort put into lads' clubs and increased social care from liberal reforms reflects this. The story of the scuttlers was one of anger and violence, but with increasingly egalitarian views that came at the end of the century, and a greater understanding of the effects of poverty, it was one that died out relatively quietly.